Okay, so good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos e a todos. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. It's really a privilege to host this conference. The school has been working in the field of law and development for a long time. I think since we decided to create our graduate program, it was an enormous debate about in which area we should focus. And the decision at that time was law and development. And then it started a new debate about what we were talking about. And in fact, I think the school has a very plural perspective on the law and development debate, but mostly we are dealing with a concept of law in context, how law could work and contribute to the development in several aspects of the Brazilian society. So it's wonderful to have some of the founders of this movement, some of those who are on the front edge of this movement, to talk with us here today. It's nice to have all the colleagues, those who were our colleagues and are abroad at this moment, and colleagues from other schools. So really a privilege to have all of you here today. Also, I would like to mention that for me, it's a particular pleasure to have Catarina, which I admire enormously from a long time, and about her book, because she was here, I think, 2 years ago when you made a presentation that had a lot of impact. I was very impacted by your presentation, and I was waiting for the book with a lot of expectations, so it's fantastic that you came here again to launch the book. I think all of us are waiting for your talk. So please, Catarina.
Thank you very much. I might just stay here and sit. I have to disappoint you a little bit because we launched the book yesterday evening, but I will give you a private launch later on if you want. So I'm going to talk about law and development, which I was asked to say something about for today. And the title of my talk and the paper that I circulated is Towards Comparative Legal Institutionalism. Dave already knows part of the story because I gave the paper at NYU at a law and development workshop in December of last year. And at that December workshop, Frank Upham was there as well. And Frank gave me his latest book, The Fallacy of Property, which, and after I gave my talk, he said, you know, I think I did what you were talking about in my book. And so I used his book as an illustration for my theory in the paper that I have revised ever since. So I hope I can convince you that not only that my approach makes sense, but also I can show you now how it works, because one of Dave's critiques at the NYU workshop said, you know, you convince me only if you can show me how it works. So I hope I can do that. Okay, the outline of my talk is I want to say a little bit about what I mean by comparative legal institutionalisms. And of course, I have to go through the exercise of what is institutions, what are institutionalisms, and I will have to say something about the meaning of law here. I want to talk about why I find comparative methodology important. I can say up front, this is critical, I think, if you want to identify mechanisms through which things are related to each other. So single case studies are not as powerful as well-selected comparative case studies, and we've seen some of them being presented already yesterday. So I think many people are already themselves doing that. I don't have to convince you of that. I want, nonetheless, juxtapose comparative legal institutionalism with some other approaches that are in the literature and show you what I think I can add by this approach. And then last but not least, of course, I want to use Frank's book to show how it can work in practice. So the aspirations of comparative legal institutionalisms is to do a number of things, and that overlaps with what others are trying to do as well, but I don't think that all of the elements are present in the approaches that I will discuss later. So I think what we want to do is we want to understand the origins of institutions. So where do institutions come from? We want to understand processes of institutional change. We want to know how institutions affect certain outcome measures, but we also have to be careful about the kind of outcome measures that we select. So individual institutions may not have a direct outcome on economic growth. It's just too complex a phenomenon. So we have to make sure that the matching works at some level, or that we look at intermediate growth factors that might tell us something indirectly about growth, but that are closer to the institutions that we are measuring. And of course, the selection of the outcome measures and of course of the institutions that we're studying is determined by the theory that we might select or the examples that we might select. And I want to be agnostic right now about the specific theory. Are you interested, are you a Marxist and you want to look at certain relations that would be determined by that theory? Are you a neoliberalist? I think in either case, you may want to use an institutional approach. I also think that we should discuss definitely the affinity of certain types of institutions to social or economic systems, but I don't think we should limit ourselves at the outset to capitalist systems per se. And I think most institutionalist approaches or similar comparative law approaches do so, and I think that's too limiting, and I will say more about this later. And I think we absolutely have to bring in the relationship between institutions and critical power wielders, but not only state or public power wielders, but also private power wielders. And so we have to think about the role of the state and law, however defined in that context, and we have to do this, as I said before, through well-selected, carefully selected case studies. So we talked yesterday already about different approaches to institutions and the various institutionalisms in new institutional economics, in sociology, and in history. And I will just have a rough overview here to remind ourselves. So institutionalism is basically an approach for studying social systems. Some focus mostly on individual behavior. New institutional economics tends to do that. Others are focusing on collective behavior or structures. That would be my preference. But again, I think you can put both under the umbrella of institutionalism. Institutions have been defined by North, of course, as the rules of the game, but he also says as humanly devised constraints on individual behavior. They're outcome determinative, and they're also highly path dependent. And then Afna-Grief, by contrast, basically says institutions are regularized patterns of behavior. So he looks at the outcome that regularized patterns of behavior produce, or only something that has achieved already in society certain patterns of regularized behavior, he would call an institution. So that would drive a wedge between a norm that says, I want to be an institution like a formal law, and actual practices. So it's the product of sustained collective action. Institutional change, again, new institutional economics, of course, says that change is mostly path-dependent unless you have some kind of an exogenous shock. On the other hand, especially the historical institutionalism, folks have said there is institutional change occurring all the time at a much more incremental level, but the accumulation of incremental change can actually have far-reaching implications. And Kathleen Thelen, Mario, you mentioned her yesterday, Kathleen Thelen and her colleagues have basically identified certain types of mechanisms through which incremental institutional change can occur, such as displacement, layering, drift, conversion, or exhaustion. So at the face value, these institutions might not change at all, but underneath a lot of things are changing. And those of you who came to the book launch last night, I think some of the examples that we discussed here show you how actually legal change does that all the time. You know, you convert one institution into another, but basically by way of analogy. You're pushing the limits of certain legal arrangements, right? So they're drifting or they're being converted into a different application. So I think that's really at the core of what's happening in particular in private law, but in law more generally. So the specific, I think, institutionalism of comparative legal institutionalism, so my personal preference, as I said, would be to look at collective behavior and structures, but I think individual behavior could be the subject of analysis as well. I would say that institutions are not only constraining behavior, but they're enabling and empowering behavior. And the differential effect that institutions have on different members of society is the root cause for distributional effects. And I think we have to be mindful of that. The effect of institutions is not equal for everybody, but it has distributional effects. Institutional change. So I think, of course, especially when we talk about legal institutionalism, we're thinking about legislative change, we're thinking about precedents, so we don't, I think, we're less concerned with exogenous shocks unless you say that every legislative change is an exogenous shock, which I think is a little extreme. It's part of the system that we live in. So that these could be major shifts. But I think the effects of these shifts are often softened by incremental change that tries to push back to the previous equilibrium. So very often when we have a major legislative change, the best example is always tax law, but you find this in other areas of law as well. You make a change and then you see that everybody's working to try to get around that change. That's what private lawyers do. And of course, incremental change is another source of constant shift and change as well. Okay, so let me come to the meaning of law. So there are different, of course, debates are always going on what is law and how should we define law and how should we think about law. More recently, Gillian Hatfield and Barry Weingast have written a paper which is called What is Law? And they basically have said, actually, we can define law without the state and its coercive powers. So as long as there is some authority, they don't really explain where this authority comes from, but as long as there's some authority that can convey to the society a common logic, what the rules are, so you can verify this is actually the rule, the enforcement of these rules can ultimately be left to private parties, because they will have an interest in investing in the enforcement of rules, because they, and especially even if their own interests are not directly affected, because they might have similar interests in the future. So they want to uphold the rules, and so might even invest to make sure that somebody else is not cheated or somebody else's contract is not breached, because they want to have clean contract rules because they will benefit from that. So they're basically thinking about law as a coordination game. The alternative view is to say law is inextricably linked to states and the consolidation of power, the monopolization of power in the hands of nation states. And that had this transformative effect of society, that not individuals enforce their own rights by way of feud or self-help, but you delegate the enforcement of disputes to certain state actions. That's basically what Jeff Hodgson has argued. There are, of course, normative theories of law that tell you something about whether rules have to meet certain normative requirements before we call them law, whether these are procedurally or substantive. I will just put those aside and say we can, of course, and should have a debate about what law in its aspiration and normative justification should look like, but that shouldn't limit ourselves from looking at the kinds of mechanisms that actually determine collective behavior in our societies and changes in certain institutions. So what I'm using here is what I would call a modified Hodgson approach to law. So I'm basically saying legal ordering is the institutionalized mediation of state power. So it is all about state power. The question is how we use that. And state power is not only used by the state, but by other agents as well. So it's about the mediation of state power. But in an institutionalized fashion, that means in a regularized fashion. So it's predictable at a certain level. Not every outcome, not every behavior is predictable, but there's certain regularized patterns of behavior. So in the West, what we call law has become that type of institutionalized mediation of state power. These are formal rules that evolve in a certain way, and this has, of course, changed over time. We started with decrees by a monarch or something, and then we introduced parliamentary power and checks and balances, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can refine what law is, and that's part of the political process, right? But it's a particular historical evolution of the mediation of the coercive powers of the state through what we call law in the West. And of course, it has been transposed into other parts of the world, but it's not necessarily the only way in which we can institutionalize state power. So what we also have seen in the West is sort of a separation between the public law and criminal law on the one hand. You can separate them further, and private law. And I recall Anna mentioned yesterday that maybe we should reconsider how strong the divide is between private and public law, or private and criminal law. But I still want to say that it's probably an important feature of Western law, this kind of division between private and public law, because what it really means is that private agents can avail themselves of the coercive powers of the state to order their horizontal relations with one another. in a way that may not have been available in other societies, and I'll come back to that. So I think we have produced a three-dimensional pattern of legal ordering in that sense, between states and citizens, top-down, and have sort of restricted the ways in which states can use this power by imposing procedural constraints. Citizens, that's the private ordering that I was talking about, but also citizen states. That's basically when we advance into like a rule of law-based state, where we say we also use law to constrain power directly. You can't touch my property rights unless you compensate me for that. And we have other civil and political rights that we can defend against the state itself. That's a particular manifestation. So we can even use the state's power against itself because we can go to a court and have these rulings. You know, enforcing that against the state is complicated and it's better developed in some countries than others. But if we, you know, play by the rules of the constitutional game, then in principle we should be able to do so. Again, this doesn't happen everywhere, and I think we should analyze that and where it happens and where it doesn't happen. So my key point here is that there's more than one way to mediate power. There are alternative or complementary manifestations of the mediation of coercive state power. There is top-down ordering through administrative and criminal decrees and limited access to state power for purpose of private ordering. But there's still regularized patterns of how this power is used. It's not just by fiat. Very often in our debates we say it's either it's law or it's fiat. But there are other ways in which you can create relatively regularized behaviors. It might not be nice, frankly. We might also say part of the regularized behavior is that we know that, let's say, the Communist Party will at some point launch another anti-corruption campaign and just execute a couple of folks, right? That could also be part of the regularized patterns of behavior. So I'm making no normative claims. I'm just saying there are different ways of doing that. And so I think if we think back to China in particular, in its long legal history of having top-down administrative criminal-driven decrees, sort of if you look at the Qing Code and earlier manifestations of Chinese law, it was largely but not exclusively top-down legal ordering. There's now evidence that actually many more merchants were able to avail themselves of these top-down decrees to also resolve disputes with one another, but probably to a lesser extent than what was common in the West. And I think this top-down administrative ordering is something that we can still see in China today. It's no longer done by the monarch and the emperor in Beijing, but some of the Communist Party in Beijing, right? That's sort of the source of stability and ultimately the source of policy directions that are being followed by bureaucrats around the country. You have disciplinary party supervision in many organizations, etc. That's a form of mediating state power as well, right? And it looks different from the West, but I'm not sure we should therefore basically exclude it from the analysis. So I want to go as far as saying, let's just call comparative legal institutionalism, let's call everything law that is a regularized institutionalization of state powers, of the mediation of state power in certain ways. Now, some people won't like it because it doesn't look like our law, and I just want to make clear, I'm not making normative claims. And I also think that we should look at our own Western law, not only by saying, well, this is great because we have all this separation of power and it works so nicely. We have a normative aspiration of how law should look like and how it should be used, but it can also be used in other ways. And I think the examples that Frank Upham has put together, which are drawn from the UK, the US, from Japan, China, and Cambodia, actually show you that the law in the West doesn't work so fundamentally different in his case studies than it does in China or Cambodia. Japan was an exception in this particular case. So if I compare now the comparative legal institutional approach, and I just gave you the couple of core features that I think an institutional approach should explain to help us understand the world, I'm just comparing this with a couple of other standard approaches in the literature. One is like old-fashioned comparative law, and of course it doesn't do a lot of these things because it's really focused so much on black letter law or maybe case law that it doesn't deliver on the social aspects of institutional analysis. So it doesn't really tell us much about processes of institutional change as applied by classic conventional comparative law scholarship. It doesn't tell us much about the effects of institutions on certain outcomes. It doesn't say much about the affinity of institutions with social systems. It might be assumed because we're looking at civil codes and so we think it's all capitalism, but it just doesn't explain very much. Then I just put in here the so-called new comparative economics, which came out of the scholarship of the law and finance literature, Laporta, Lopez Estellanos, Schleifer, and Vizhny, and they wrote this paper in 2003. The new comparative economics, they basically said communism is dead, socialism is dead, so the real thing that we should do now is compare different capitalist systems with one another. And they use the legal families as the major divide in the world, common law versus civil law, and try to explain why civil law, common law systems make a particular choice at a certain point in time. So they look into the origins of institutions at the point in time when these legal systems were created. In their view, it was in the 11th century when in England the choice was made for a decentralized jury system, whereas in France, where things were politically more volatile, it was top-down central organization. And ever since, it's just path dependency, right? So you have to believe that kind of story. And then I'm not going to go through all these different iterations, but so this would just take too long. But I'm just trying to basically give some heft to the analytical categories that I have created. Let me just say a few words about law and development. I think sort of for law and development, many of the origins of the legal institutions are transplants, because we're very often dealing with countries that have received their formal legal systems from other parts of the world, either by imposition or sometimes by selection. And the idea, of course, is that we use law as an instrument of change. The focus is very much traditionally on formal law, as described in the Western history earlier. I think the process of institutional change is somewhat under theorized, and it's always the struggle to understand the difference between formal law on the one hand and what happens on the ground on the other. The idea is that we want to use law as an instrument to facilitate economic development. I think there's an affinity with capitalism that is assumed because that's the most successful economic system to produce development. But that could also be, I think, further spelled out. The importance of power, I think, has been recognized clearly ever since 1974, when Dave and Mark Gallanter wrote the paper on scholars and self-estrangement. And so I think that has become a much more important part of law and development ever since. And the role of law and the state, of course, is mostly to try to use these instruments of law and legal change as a mode of development in a state-led development strategy. More than anything else. I myself was one of the many co-authors of this paper, Legal Institutionalism, together with Geoff Hodgson, so you can also see the affinity between what I'm doing and what we were doing there. I think, somebody said this yesterday already, that this approach is still underdeveloped. I think that's true, and so I'm trying to make the next step by saying, first of all, we paid lip service to comparative analysis in the paper, but we didn't show how it would be done. I think it should be part and parcel of the analysis. And the other thing that I would not do again is we basically said this is for legal institutionalism, is for capitalist systems only. And I don't want to make that move again. I just think we should be open to that. We have accepted a certain affinity of certain types of institutions that we associate with capitalism, but I think the rise of China shows us that even that is a little bit of a fallacy, right? So we have in China a vibrant market economy, maybe not with a whole slew of institutional arrangements that we have in the West, but it's still a communist country, and there still is other governance mechanisms. It doesn't have the extent of property rights protection, but enough actually to make this economy work. So I think we should rethink the affinity of institutions to different economic systems. And of course, we know from the comparative capitalism's literature that capitalism can also occur in many, many different ways. And there's, I think, a continuum between different economic systems, and we should just be open to that and not limit ourselves for that. Okay. So if you don't mind, I just want to move on and talk about Upham's Fallacy of Property, a book that was published at Cambridge University Press last year. And he looks at 5 case studies. His major goal in this book, I think, is to say, the neoclassical or new institutional economics has it wrong, because they always say property rights are great for growth and development, and he shows you in case study after case study that this is really not the case. I'm basically I don't think I'm abusing, but I'm reusing his case studies to show you how you can do a really well-designed case study in comparative case analysis and comparative legal institutionalisms. Because he uses 5 cases, they're actually in different geographies, different points in time, but they all have an underlying common theme, and that's the formation of property rights. So he looks at the enclosure movement in England in the 16th century. He looks at the redefinition of property rights in North America and the United States, with the example of water rights in the 19th century during the process of industrialization. He uses land reforms in Japan after World War II. He uses land reforms in Cambodia after the Civil War, and he uses the emergence of foreign direct investment, but also small property rights. There's a couple of different smaller case studies for China to investigate the role of property rights in economic development. So his interpretations of what he's doing differ from what I'm doing, but I think the cases are just enormously interesting. I shared my interpretation with him before I came. I got his blessing, so I'm not doing something that he wouldn't be aware of or I think would disagree with. He was actually quite pleased. Okay, so again, I won't go through all of that, but I just want to show you basically how this lines up. So in England, I said he uses the enclosure movement, and he shows how courts redefined what property rights were. That's what they did. They didn't enforce property rights. They basically said that the right to exclude were all of a sudden present when they had not been present before, and the right to exclude was a right that the landlords could exercise and not the commoners. And so that took some time. It took over a century, but that was the result of the major enclosure battles throughout the 16th century. So law was used to reallocate property rights in a peaceful manner. Largely peaceful, right? There was the Black Act that basically imposed capital punishment on commoners who would trespass on the land of the landlords eventually, but relatively speaking, it wasn't a social revolution, but it was done by way of law. In the United States, he uses a water rights case where a couple in Pennsylvania sort of has this property, and it's all, they want to be sort of outside in the nice green neighborhood. They want to have clean water, and they settle there, and then all of a sudden there's a mining company settling upstream and polluting the water that they get, and so they sue. Now, riparian water rights, which were brought over by England, basically said, well, who comes first, has the first rights to the water and should get the clean water. And the courts basically said, well, your personal inconvenience should be compared with the great economic development that the mining company brings us, and so you just get a pittance. So also a case that went through the court several times back and forth. In the end, the court says the better right is on the side of the mining company, right? So it shifts. Contrary to precedents, it shifts property rights. I come back to Japan, that's sort of the sole exception in these cases. In China, he talks about township and village enterprises, about FDI, urbanization, and small property rights. And he basically says, first of all, since he uses also a formal definition of law, he says in China you get economic development without property rights. And he says, so, there are different things are happening. There are party guidelines. There are some lawyers who try to mimic property rights through contractual devices to give them more heft, and that is very often also sanctioned by either party policies or local governors who buy into that. And I'm basically saying, well, that is a certain type of mediation of the coercive powers of the state, so I would call it legal in my definition. So if they can use legal instruments to secure certain rights, and that is sort of sanctioned by the party and local government officials, that's good enough for me. Courts are weak in China, courts are weak in Cambodia, courts are weak in Japan, so that's a different story here. But in England and the United States, it's the courts that are doing the job. In Cambodia, after the civil war, you get a major land reform. The torrens system from Australia is being transposed into Cambodia. There was some debate whether one should have used the Japanese model instead, but that's basically what they do with World Bank backing. But so the idea was, and the story was, that you would get land reform both for social objectives, you would resettle all the people who have been dispossessed, and at the same time you would create economic development programs to give some land to industrialists and foreign investors to develop the country. by and large, the economic development plans were implemented. Of course, there was a lot of corruption going on as well, but sort of there were big swatches of land where you would even dispossess more people to make sure that somebody could develop the land, and there was relatively little achieved in terms of giving title to the dispossessed, especially in the most contested areas. So the World Bank also privileged areas where there was not much of a dispute because they wanted to show how great their system worked by titling a lot of land where you actually didn't need title because people had agreed on who had what kind of property rights, but the contentious areas were not really titled. In Japan, sort of the one exception in his examples is the land reform after World War II. So land reform had been highly concentrated in the hands of sort of major landowners who had a lot of tenants, so they didn't work the land themselves, but they had tenants that had lesser rights. And under the American occupation, and with a government now in place that had sort of just come out from a devastating war, the decision was made to reallocate the land to the tenants and not to give the landlords full market value, but to give them much less. And the courts back that as well. They said sort of for our social goals are now sort of to create a stable democracy, want to distribute property rights, and you just get much less for that. And so this is the only case, so I come back to that in a sense, the only case where the trend went in the opposite direction, from the strong to the weak rather than from the weak to the strong in terms of the reallocation of property rights. So I think, again, I can share the tables with you later. It would take me too much time to walk through this right now. I'd much rather have some discussion. So what I will do instead, so I just want to show you that for all of these dimensions, I think I can say something about how it works in these different systems. But let me just come to the comparative analysis. Because what struck me when I basically read his book through the lens of comparative legal institutionalisms is that there are just remarkable common patterns across these different case studies over time and in very different geographies. So the first thing was that the formation of new property rights was always the destruction of other property rights. And we should just be very clear about this. It's totally intuitive, but we tend to forget this when we think about the creation of property rights, always a good thing. Of course, it's always the destruction of other property rights. And in most cases, in 4 out of 5 cases, it was always the destruction of property rights of the poor and the weak in favor of the creation of new property rights of the stronger and the richer, if you want. The only exception was Japan, in a very peculiar political situation after the loss of a major war and with an occupying force that wanted these reforms to be done. So the first legislation for the land reforms had actually created much better compensation packages and many more veto points for the landlords, and that was eliminated after the Americans sort of stepped in again. So that's sort of interesting to see that whether you are using this through Western law and the courts are doing the job, or whether you're doing this in China or in Cambodia and sort of the courts are weak and somebody else, the legislators are doing it, or the party is doing it, ultimately you get the same outcome. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is that a major shift in property rights on that scale is typically followed by years and years, if not decades and centuries of entrenchment. So it's not that we constantly reallocate property rights. We sometimes do that, and then you get something that the new institutional economists would call path dependency. Underneath, of course, we see a lot of little incremental change, but in none of the case studies that Frank has looked at do we see that the elites who have benefited from the original change have changed fundamentally. So they were able to entrench themselves. So there is actually a good point for path dependency here. So transformative change is a rare occurrence and happens only in certain political moments, and it helps actually sort of entrench a particular elite. The transformation of property rights had measurable economics and social effects. If you give a lot of assets into the hands and consolidate them in the hands of a few people, you get economic growth. You get that. There's a price that you pay for that, and I think we have to make this price very explicit. But there was a redistribution from bottom to top in 4 out of 5 cases, and that stimulated growth and development. There was always in most cases, you can see some trickle down to the poor that had been left behind in future generations. So the people who were dispossessed in the enclosure movement in England, eventually they participated in greater progress that they might not otherwise have seen, but that was not necessarily the generation that was dispossessed. So if you take the long view, but you also have to think through, of course, then you know the proletariat that goes into the factories, etc., etc. But you know there is growth and progress that comes, but there's a price to be paid as well. So there's some trickle-down effect that we see from these changes. In all of these cases, I think we see an affinity with capitalist development. It was causal in England. That's the classic story. We do enclosure. In the stories, typically we create efficient property rights. Once you have them, people will invest and reap the returns on their investments. And we, of course, don't talk much about the dispossessed, but it has this causal effect for industrialization in England. It is very supportive of industrialization in 19th century United States. It promotes market development in China, even in communist China. And it's meant to jumpstart a kind of capitalist regime in Cambodia. And in that regard, it's actually quite effective. State power played a key role in all cases. None of these major formative moments would have happened without the state powers putting their weight behind these property reforms. It's just that we do this again through different channels. So courts are the vehicle, as Frank Appel says, the vehicle of legal change in the UK and the United States. Legislative and administrative means are the vehicles of change in Cambodia, China, and Japan. And again, if you look at the history of these countries, the long-term history, that's not so surprising, right? It sort of reminds you of sort of patterns of institutionalized state power that existed earlier. And of course, then on top of that, Japan is a civil law country. China is also being boxed into the civil law country category, where courts are in general weaker than they are in common law countries. So just to, again, summarize, what is the effect of law defined in the CLI approach that I use here is that law was actually quite instrumental for all of these changes. Sometimes law is not effective, and we have so many examples in law and development where law just doesn't work, but also we should think about when it works and for whom it works. And maybe we don't find the effects that we want because we don't sufficiently understand the political economy behind that. So what law has done, it has allowed for a massive redistribution of property rights in a largely peaceful fashion. And it's legitimized through the stories that we tell about the law. So I just quote Upham here. He says, "This enabled English society to eat its cake and have it too, to retain its sense of the sanctity of property while enjoying the rapid economic growth made possible by the destruction of the property rights of its weakest members." That's his analysis of the enclosure movement in England. Of course, it doesn't quite square with the idea of creating efficient property rights as sort of the beginning of capitalism. I think both is true, but we just have to talk about both as well. Private power was also relevant in all cases, and that's also important to realize. So they were aligned with or have instrumentalized state power. I think Brodel's famous talk about the prince and the merchant is a nice analogy here. The horizontal dimension of law that I talked about before, that private parties can avail themselves of state power to organize their own private affairs, is most explicit in the common law countries, in the UK and the US, where the courts are the location of change and where it's done through litigation, right? And whereas in other countries, the site of these struggles is elsewhere. It's more in administrative guidance, policy guidance through the Communist Party, and relatively little in courts. Again, sort of the only major exception is Japan, but it was also a peculiar moment in history, and I think it's important to realize that. It's also important to realize that there were outside powers in play. There were also outside powers in play in the case of Cambodia, because the World Bank was there, and sort of they put a lot of pressure and had the money and resources to do something, but they did not really control the internal political economy. So basically, domestic players were using the opening that the World Bank gave them to favor strong economic interests that would use the reallocation of property rights for economic development programs, but not for finding new land for the formerly dispossessed. So I think what makes Japan an exception is sort of the strong influence of the occupying power, the conditions the countries found itself in. So this was a moment of great uncertainty, and where entrenched interests were not less powerful. One thing that Frank discusses in his book is what the economic effects might have been. He says that he looks at it somewhat critically, basically saying that the land reforms have entrenched the former tenants, now landowners, too much, and there's not a very mobile land market in the country, and maybe this has had some negative economic outcomes. But he said in the end that this is still disputed on the economic effects. Generally, the Japanese model was justified inside Japan as basically saying we prioritize not economic outcomes in these land reforms, but political outcomes. We want to have a stable democracy, and we want to have people have land, and we want to basically have a buy-in by the tenants of land in Japan into our new democratic projects, which is why they did what they did. So that's basically it. I just want to walk you through that, and let me open this for questions and comments. Thank you. I can take whatever.
So there's so much that I like in the presentation, and I've been to comparative law conferences where people have these ongoing and intense methodological debates. I've been to a lot of law and development conferences where people have intense and ongoing methodological debates. And when I think about your use of Frank's work, one of the things that comes to mind is people are always talking about an ideal type of how to do good comparative analysis, right? This is recurrent in all of these fields. But the sort of looming thing in the background is bad comparative analysis, which seems increasingly to be everywhere, right? So the great property fallacy pushes back on the fact that there's this recalcitrant way in which people talk about property rights in comparative context that draws sort of like the wrong lessons or has the wrong presuppositions. If you go to comparative law conferences, the doing business still comes up. But part of why it comes up is because this bad comparative analysis will never go away, right? It's increasingly in some ways popular. Right? It's still used by governmental actors. It's still referenced in a lot of ways. And some of like this more nuanced comparative institutional good analysis sort of gets pushed to the side. And I think that's part of like the existential dilemma of people in these fields is that we're continuing to make methodological refinements and do better work, but this other genre of work continues to have more relevance in real world sort of like decision making by political actors. So I just wanted to get your sort of like thoughts on, in putting forth this sort of like new methodological renovation, how do you think about that in the context to the increasing proliferation and relevance of what would, by these standards, be sort of very flawed or sort of bad comparative analysis?
It's an excellent question, and I guess you can imagine the answer. I mean, I've had debates already years ago with Jankov, who was one of the leaders of the doing business indicators, and he said, well, you say it's all very complicated. We have to do case analysis and context specific and look at the power arrangement. If I get a delegation from a country and I just show them, here are my indicators, and this is what your economic outcomes will be if you change the indicators, and you say it's very complicated and do X, Y, and Z, guess what they will do? And of course, they do the other. On the other hand, I think these doing business indicators and the use of indicators, which are not only measurements, they become their own governance technology, as Davis and others have suggested, I think quite rightly. I think we are also increasingly seeing that there's just no change that is achieved. You can change your indicators and you can get up in the ranking, but it doesn't really change the dynamics on the ground. So I think I hope that these indicators will be looked at slightly more critically. I think the indicators have changed a lot in the doing business and the World Bank. I don't really want, sometimes I'm asked to be involved in that. I just don't like indicators, so I don't get involved. So I think the temptation still to have some meaningful, easy measurement is sort of a really powerful temptation, which is still very strong. I don't think we can get against that, especially if the results of these indicators show what the most powerful actors, both public and private, want to see. They basically say, if we do this, then we get this growth rates going up. So it's all aligning in the right direction. And of course, it is putting to a side the effects on those whom the World Bank should actually serve as the organization that has to alleviate poverty. So I'm afraid we are still in the minority, and I don't see how we can fundamentally change that debate.
Here, Katarina, thank you so much for your presentation, which is fantastic and very interesting, very thoughtful. I just wanted to know a bit more about the relationship between concentration of property rights and economic growth. is that causality? Is that correlation? Is that something that we can take for granted? Because you mentioned that, but I didn't.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
something
So
that we can?
I'm basically reinterpreting the data that everybody will show you. So if you look at, if you go to Acemoglu et al., or just the assertions that North makes without empirical data, or that people look at, looking at institutions and growth is always a difficult thing, right? But there has been a strong argument that property rights reforms and the creation of individualized property rights has gone hand in hand and was a precondition for capitalism to emerge. And I'm basically saying that's just a partial view, because when we look at what actually happened, it was a consolidation of property rights in the hands of the powerful. That was the trigger, right? So let's just name it what it is, and then the outcome, I can't really dispute the outcome, because in all of these cases we see at least a strong correlation. We can still, of course, in both arguments and both interpretations, you can always sort of debate whether there is a true causality. But I think if you look at these patterns, also in these countries, right, in all of these countries, these quite draconian property destructions and new creations have had major economic impact, and it's difficult to argue that away.
I was thinking about the relationship between legal institutionalism and normative claims, or the relationship with policy projects. And building on Diogo's question, I think from your presentation there is a very troubling scenario in which these changes were helpful for economic growth, as you said, but at the same time they were quite unfair to the weakest members of society. And I think some of those themes are also present in your book. So what? So how do we incorporate those very interesting and valuable lessons to the project of improving our societies?
Yeah. Well, I think, the first thing for me is always like, if we have a better diagnosis, let's just try to understand what's really going on. And I think there are, of course, normative conclusions that you would draw from this diagnosis. And one of that is, first of all, you just can't believe the general recipe. It's, at least not, yes, you can get growth out of it, but you have to think about the costs and who's bearing the cost, and also what the political implications of these costs might be, right? And you can be cynical about this and can say, we want to write off an entire generation because we think that future generations will benefit. I don't think that this is how they calculated at the beginning, but I think this is what we see. But you can also say maybe the political costs are such that we just don't want to face them, right? And in a, let's say, post-Civil War scenario, you may want to think twice whether you want to, dispossess against additional people. And I think the Japanese example shows you, however, that you can set different norms. You need a very powerful argument and a coalition of people who back that. I think ideally backed also by an outside power, which in theory the World Bank could be, but it has to shift its ideological stance to do so. But I think you need a coalition of people who say, our goal is something different. We might forsake growth rates to say we want to have a peaceful democracy or a stable democracy, and that requires that we have a much more equitable distribution of assets, not totally egalitarian, but more equitable distribution of assets. And I think I said this yesterday already in the context of my book, it's if you want to think about how to help the poor, then you have to think about how they have assets that are giving them also some durability, some kind of safety over time. Not only the property rights that DeSoto wants to give them for monetizing their assets, but also something that helps them to survive the next business cycle, because they're not defrauding somebody when they can't pay their loans, but they might just not be able to do so.
Thanks. There's lots of stuff, but and I've really liked the presentation, but let me try to focus on one aspect, which goes back to what also Diogo was mentioning. So if we think about the work of Acemoglu and all that type of institutional, type of school, institutional school and so on, there is a fundamental problem there, that when we look today at LDC's countries, or even many middle-income countries, property rights don't lead to necessarily to actually economic growth. In fact, they can be a way of, as you pointed out, allocating and concentrating power in the hands of the few who are not actually having any interest, and there is no compulsion for them to make investment and transform their economies. So I've done quite a lot of work in looking at, now I'm looking at your analysis through the lenses of developmental state and the comparative political economy of that across the last 2 centuries of developmental state. And you rightly pointed out that the state play a critical role in this conversion of institutions, the formalization of that. But also in doing that, basically, is allocating rents. Any type of law is actually, whatever it is, through tax, to import regulations, to whatever. So my point is, how in all your analysis, the problem of the political economy conditions play a role in explaining when property rights leads or not to economic development. And to be more precise, all the experiences of developmental state which were successful showed an element of lack of fragmentation among the powerful, or an element of alignment of interest which was actually supporting long-term commitment of resources, and lots of failures as well, right? So if we compare, Mushtaq has done the typical comparison between Pakistan and Korea and so on, we can look at lots of factors, but there is a fundamental characteristics in the developmental state in Pakistan when the Korean went there to learn how to do developmental state in the 60s, which was the fact that the fragmentation of among the powerful within the ruling coalition outside is such that it's very difficult to reach any conversion or play any use the law to convert property rights in investment and transformation. So I'm just trying to figure out how you factor in that element of power fragmentation or instability, which makes difficult to transform this framework into something that in practice then realize in many of these countries.
Yeah, I think I need to think more about this. It's a great question, but let me just give you my spontaneous reaction. I think it depends a little bit also. I think there's a triangulated relationship between the coalition of the powerful or the fragmentation of the powerful and the institutional mechanism. So I think in systems like England or the United States, where the courts became the vehicle of change, fragmentation doesn't hurt, because actually you can avail yourselves of, dispersed courts to make your case, and you can be very strategic in trying to achieve change by pushing for court cases. And people do this. I mean, it's on both ends. So the litigants sort of try to find the case to make that legal change in a common law, and the courts are ceding their arguments, even if they're like in minority decisions at the Supreme Court or else, where they're ceding already their legal arguments that can help you overturn a precedent in the future. So that's happening all the time. So I think in a system where you have decentralized vehicles of legal change, I'm not sure that the coalition argument is such a powerful one, but that's sort of probably the exceptions rather than the rule. You see this in the common law countries. In other countries where basically the vehicle of change is consolidated state power, the fragmentation, the thinking about which is the right coalitional alliance that you can get behind the change that is powerful enough to really invoke change becomes a critical outcome variable. So I think I would put those two together. I'm not sure how successful has been the transplantation of like a more decentralized system. You don't really get this so much. I mean, the British colonies got sort of court systems from the get-go, but I don't think the courts in Pakistan are as powerful as they are in England at the time. So it's, but that's something to be that I would be looking into. Oh, Leslie.
Hi. Hi, Katerina.
Oh, so hi, Wendy.
Hi, sorry. Oh,
Didn't
hang
see
on.
you. Yeah.
Anyway, you'll hear me. So thank you. I've got a lot to think about, but I've got a couple of clarifications. When you're saying law, as an institution, is it all law, or are there different bodies of law within that institution that can prompt changes in, within itself? So, for example, linking back to Diogo's comment, there's more and more studies showing the link between, or correlation at least, between increasing profits leading to increasing concentration, then leading to increased inequality. And at least in antitrust law, it seems that there's a point in time now where the enforcement approach is changing, and there's a real scope to change, because since the late 1970s, especially in America, antitrust enforcement, it's had a very, very lax approach to antitrust. And not to say that everyone else, but the Americans have been incredibly influential in persuading everyone else to also be lax. But now, I mean, we have presidential candidates talking about breaking up these big data, these technology companies, etc. So we're at this point where potentially it can all change. So I'm just wondering, like within the legal institution, can you kind of change things?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think in the systems where we have, lots of different legal arenas that have developed lots of different legal arenas, and many systems, including China, have done this today, but they don't all play the same role, and you can't easily shift between them. But I think in the United States in particular, you see these shifts, right? So when I think about, when you think about corporate law and antitrust in the 19th century, so the Sherman Act triggered basically the major innovations in corporate law in New Jersey and then later in Delaware, that actually a corporation can hold shares in another corporation. So the big trust companies that were supposed to be broken down under the Sherman Act could reconstitute themselves as holding companies, which hadn't been possible before, right? So you can shift from the domain of antitrust into something else because all of a sudden it's all, intra-firm, no longer on the market, so it can't be reached by antitrust unless there's another legislative change that comes down and tries to crack down on that as well. So that's, I think, the game that is happening. And I think, and at the same time, you play the game bottom up from the actors who are trying to strategically do a regulatory arbitrage around new rules. But you can see this also by the policymakers. They do not have to change the law to basically make law enforcement, or the imposition of regulations. I talked about to Diogo about this yesterday as well. What is about the regulatory state? But you can decapitate the regulatory state simply by constraining its resources, and that's how it's done in the United States. Either don't enforce, you don't give them the money to enforce. So the SEC and of course the CFTC with its sunset provisions have always had problems sort of getting the Congress behind them so they could continue to do their regulatory action. If you set this up in this way, then it can also go both ways. A new presidential administration can strengthen antitrust, right? And a new political environment can strengthen that and could find a crackdown. Now, if this was to happen, I'm sure that the big tech companies would try to find another way around it, right? And in part also because they're now global platforms. I'm not sure how, unless the EU, of course, comes together, they could still be have a real effect. But they could constitute themselves in different ways as well, through contractual arrangements or through the new digital platforms, which become their own site of ordering. So I think these shifts that happen once in a while, I think they get eroded again by sort of, you have the shift, and of course the parties that lose from the shift, they will do everything to soften the blow by either, trying to convince the next administration not to enforce, or to find other ways where they can shift the arena of their own stronghold of power. So in principle, any area of the law is within my scope of interest, right? And what I find interesting is to see how the sort of shifting into different arenas is possible in different legal systems or not. Or if there's an overarching communist party, maybe it's not as easy to do that, although, they're also doing everything from shadow banking to, digital currencies in China these days as well, and some are very supervised, and others less so. So the ability of a centralized control to control is, I think, mitigated these days.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Katerina. I was wondering if we should compare the pros and cons of property rights in the short run and in the long run. So you mentioned the trickle down effect in the long run, intergenerational gains of the property rights, and economic development is for sure a long run project. So I was wondering if we should compare these pros and cons of inequality provoked by property rights in the long run and in the short run.
I think there is a trade-off in the long term and the short term to some extent, but we also shouldn't forget that many who are, the weakest members of society, they never get their assets back, right? They might get something else. So we give them social security, we call this an entitlement, we don't call this a property right. Maybe we should convert that into a property right, right? So that they have some security that this cannot be taken away from them. And it's not at the discretion of policymakers to give it to them. An interesting and, of course, dramatic case is, of course, in the United States, my colleague with slavery and post-slavery property rights. My colleague, Catherine Franke, just wrote a book which is called Repair, where she shows that after emancipation, many African Americans and former slaves were given property rights, and many of them paid for them at auctions where the land of their white former owners was auctioned off to them. And after the Civil War was over, to appease the South, they were all expropriated without compensation. So African Americans never get property. They were then offered property in areas where there's no arable land, and they have never been given a base to build their own assets. And that has structural effects to this day. Now, I can say the United States has boomed. But we just have to be, clear about the trade-offs that we are making.
Hi, this is an empirical question and then a quick empirical comment. So I was interested in your explanation of the deviant Japanese case. The question is, who was it that made it explicit that this was for political, to build democracy, was this the Japanese or was this the foreign occupiers? And then the comparative comment is another case that I think of as similar is India when it becomes independent. It's one of the few cases where in this case, the leaders of the country themselves said, okay, we are going to explicitly hold off on market development, and I think even hold off on economic growth for the sake of putting in all these redistributive policies and laws. And of course, the result is it's one of the few democracies with all its flaws that's endured in a poor country.
Yeah. I appreciate the comment about India, and I think it's a very good comment. It's also, I think, people have looked at India again, also in, this case study by Brett DeLong, I think it was in Danny Roddick's book about prosperity, where he shows that the so-called Indian rate of growth is actually quite remarkable. It's not the East Asian tigers and dragons, but it's actually quite remarkable in comparison with many African countries and other developing countries. And of course, the only actually very pluralist, ethnically, religiously pluralist developing country that has sustained democracy for such a long period of time. Who supported in Japan the priority of politics over economic growth? I think it was a combination. As I'm reading Upham's work, and I haven't double-checked his sources, but he's basically saying the occupying power clearly wanted to disempower those who had been entrenched at the time of the war, and they basically wanted them to really lose. But at the same time, he quotes a number of court cases where the landlords brought action and wanted to have higher expropriation compensation, and the wording of the law was kind of ambiguous what they should really get. And the courts were saying it's in the interest, in the social interest of the country to have social stability, and that's why you can't get the market value. So either they internalized it or they brought in their own social priors to justify that interpretation of the law.
Hi. So you've convinced me.
Thank you.
At the theoretical level.
Okay.
But I sort of feel like I might be like somebody who attends a lecture by a scientist who says you could use magnetic resonance to identify problems in the body, and all you need is this gigantic machine that somebody will have to build. So I think the next step is the challenge of actually turning this into a procedure that can be employed not for retrospective studies through secondary sources, which is great, and I've been read Frank's book. Actually, I did read it, read parts of it in draft. Now I'm going to read the whole thing. But to do research in actual countries in real time. And I think that while it's doable, it's a little bit like going from the science of magnetic resonance to those huge machines they put you in, and it's a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking, my husband is a doctor, and they're doing ultrasound diagnostic a lot, and actually he has a little portable ultrasound, and they're going on a plane with it, and they're diagnosing kids everywhere in the world if they have to. So yes, you're right. If you want to use it for policy advice, we have to find a way of dissecting this. But I think the criteria that I gave you, basically thinking through, sort of who are the actors, what are the means through which state power can be invoked in a certain way, just even looking at that, rather than just the fixation on the formal law, and we have to change that by saying, well, in this society, formal state power has always been manifested in this particular coalition, and through these particular mechanisms. So you have to go there, and you have to understand the coalition that is behind a particular entrenched situation, and you have to think about who are the others. So I think sort of the diagnostic questions, like, you do your amnesia, amnesia, you do this at the beginning when you talk to a patient, you could go through that. But it's still probably a much more, of course, time-intensive exercise than just doing, your indicators and showing, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, you get growth.
Just one quick follow-up. But it also requires institutional change in the academy, because this has to be collective This requires institutional change in the academy because this is going to require sustained, long-term, collective, transnational teamwork. And we don't have in any institution, in any north, south, east, west, or the middle, the kind of capability yet that can do that. And that seems to me the challenge, which, that's like building the machine. And I'm all in favor of it, but I think it's the next step.
Yeah, I think what I find so sad is that the major development organizations, the World Bank or the EBRD or those, that they have never ever created archives of decent case studies. So they've done it all. We know all the data about the failure for the policy recommendations that didn't work and that ran afoul. I think we could have a massive amount of resources, that looking in the past, of course, but that would help us to identify other indicators in the future as well, right? So but I think it's difficult to reconstruct this because they didn't really keep track of that. You can get this in some of their investigative reports of how their policies have done, but you don't get to sufficient details. And that's something that institutionally would have to change as well. You just have to keep track on what's happening on the ground as well. But I appreciate your support for the machine.
Hi.
Hi.
It's quite an outsider comment because I'm not very into this debate, but I have the impression that we are always assuming private property as the model, and we don't have enough study or debate on alternative models such as collective uses of property. So I think it's I have the impression that it's a self-reassuring prophecy that we cannot easily separate this debate of capitalism. So for me, it's very hard to accomplish what you were saying in the beginning. Let's try not to not to essentialize or assume capitalism if we don't study other models of organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the only case that, so it's a hybrid case in his case studies is China, right? But I think what we can see is that you can have different types of political organization being compatible with some form of property rights. And to be clear, I don't think I want to throw property rights out of the window completely, right? But I want to sort of make clear that if we, that the transformation of property rights or the creation of new property rights sort of creates a major redistribution. And it's sort of course, clear that this is what's happening, but we have to be much more explicit about that and have to think about what are the ramifications for political power. So I think there are many ways in which you can, have a much more tamed form of property rights that would be compatible with capitalism. You can also have some forms of socialism that don't look like a Soviet. There was also a particular manifestation of basically central planning or sort of a collective ownership was the Soviet model. But you don't have to have central planning of that kind. You don't have to have only state of enterprise. You could have a much more hybrid system. So I think we can open our imagination for more variations if you think in those terms.
Thank you, Katrina.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So we are gonna go back in 10 minutes. So please, the coffee break.